Please pray with me. Holy Blessed One, may the words of my mouth and meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So here we are on what the church refers to as the third Sunday of Easter. All the plastic eggs and all the bunnies have been put away, but it's still Easter season, and we're still supposed to be flush with the joy and hope of the resurrection. And baptizing the little guys is definitely a very hopeful thing to do, and it's a wonderful thing to do. Now I can go off right here on a really juicy theological tangent about the resurrection. After all, there are many, many different ways that Christians look at this. And there is no single perspective, as convenient as that might be. There are nearly 40,000 different groups on the planet that call themselves Christian. And many of them, if not most of them, think that they have the correct and appropriate interpretation and understanding of these teachings in their scriptures, and that the other groups may or may not, but it's nice they'll almost get there. And there are some people who fervently and passionately believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus, and it's core to their theology and their faith and their belief system. And then there are some who believe that this is a metaphor. It's a teaching point. It's a startling example of what transformation is all about. And in between those two are many, many different versions. And the truth is that no matter what one's perspective is, this narrative tells us that a human being who was stone clinically dead for 3 days came back to life and was seen and was touched by other human beings who spoke with him, and he continued teaching them. So if this is not the quintessential, most potent and powerful characterization of the human potential for transformation, I don't know what is. And the sad thing is that for centuries, these different groups all over the world, people have argued and dissected and analyzed and what does it mean, what it could mean, and which is the correct way to look at it, and which is the correct way to talk about it. And meanwhile, they're not doing the work of internal transformation that we're called to do. That internal transformation that we're capable of was always and is always and always has been the core, the very essence of the teachings of Yeshua ben Yosef of Nazareth. You, every person, me, we're all capable of being completely transformed from within. And that means that we can immediately attain the kingdom, this symbolic, constantly present, at-hand reality that transcends the flawed limitations and corruptibility, as my late dad would say, of the human spirit. The kingdom is at hand. When Jesus talks about kingdom, he doesn't mean some ultimate destination grand prize for winners and special people. The kingdom is here and now if only we would get out of the way and see it and live it. Because that is the radical, the truly liberating essence of Jesus' teachings. If the concept of grace is true, everybody is saved. I'm going to say that again. If the concept of grace is true, everybody is already saved. Jesus encouraged his followers not to seek quick fixes, but to connect with the Spirit of God and translate that relationship into action. He spoke of this kingdom, this reality that would break down barriers of class and ethnicity and gender and belief and hierarchy, and replacing these walls with bonds of radical and unconditional love. So we've just experienced Easter, and it always amazes me that every year the observation of these holidays have such strong psychic and emotional and spiritual meaning and impact on me and on many people that I know. And they should, especially Easter, which is so solidly anchored in hope. It's noteworthy to remember that we always recognize Easter at a specific time of year. It's very intentional. Some of you probably know this, maybe all of you do, and so I'll be didactic. But Easter always falls on the first Sunday following the first full moon that occurs on or after the first day of the vernal equinox. Who knew that? There's the theology geeks. Theology geeks, I see you, okay. So in other words, it's very intentionally tied to springtime. Now I've heard people have kidded me about, so what's the connection between the death and resurrection of the Christ and chocolate bunnies and eggs? Well, if it really has to be spelled out, let me be the guy to spell it out. Springtime is when rabbits procreate. And in neighborhoods where there are wild rabbits, you see a lot of bunnies. Springtime, symbol of springtime, okay? And the egg has universally and timelessly been a symbol of new life, not just in the past 2,000 years, but since the beginning of humankind. It's as ancient as humanity. So to choice of using springtime when our good Mother Earth comes back to life to mark the milestone that this rite of passage symbolizes, this hopeful potential of rebirth and renewal, it's very deliberate, and that's why it's so potent. And we need all the intentional pointing out that's available. Because we need to be transformed, and we need to be transformed for the sake of the world. This is my Bible. This is a prop. There is no point to any of these teachings if they don't take us out of the comfort of our living rooms, out of the comfort of this sanctuary, and put us out into the hurting world, out into the street. There's no point in any religious observation if all it does is make us feel like we're good people. Jesus didn't get executed because he was a nice guy. Okay. You know, it's often said that Jesus was put to death by Jewish leaders and the Jews wanted Jesus dead. Let's be clear about this. The Romans did not operating by responding to the whims of the occupied. Okay? Their intentional strategic objective was to conquer a region for the sake of its economic value or its strategic military value, and to leave it as stable, make it as stable as possible, as quickly as possible. So typically they would conquer an area by showing up with their massive might and leave all the institutions intact, the cultural institutions, educational and economic institutions, and religious institutions, because that's the fastest way to stability. And that gives them military advantage. Right? So this is why Pilate, who was a Roman governor, tries to immediately wash his hands of the issue of Jesus. The Pharisees bring him Jesus, and he's like, no. This is blasphemy and heresy against Judaism. This is your business. Take him out to the outskirts of town and stone him. That's what you guys do. This is not our business. But they wouldn't leave him alone. And the reason that ultimately he gave in and that Jesus was executed by Roman soldiers was not to placate the Jewish leadership. Yes, the Pharisees were not happy. Jesus was pointing out how basically they're too limited in their interpretation of Mosaic law. They're just living the letter of the law. But Jesus' teachings were also pulling people away from work. Fishermen would drop their nets. People would walk away from their housemaking and their homes. People would leave their jobs, right, and follow this guy and not do the work. So what does that mean? It means an impacted local economy. And what does that mean? That means decreased tax revenue. And what does that mean? That means a destabilized region. It's not the way the Romans play, right? In reality, Jesus was teaching the polar opposite of the priorities and values of empire. We know what it means to live in an empire. We live in an empire, right? What are the priorities of empire? Money, status, wealth, power, right? Jesus taught that these things are worthless. Yet in America, we still continue to value wealth more than human beings. 50 years ago, Martin Luther King said, "A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death." And just last year, Reverend William Barber, if you don't know who he is, look him up. He said, "We have the money, we don't have the moral capacity." Because the values of empire completely turn their back on the disenfranchised, the marginalized, the oppressed, the disabled. In fact, empires are built upon the backs of working people and poor people. Jesus was calling for a kingdom of people, a realm, if you will, of people who are living lives of unconditional love, compassion, mercy, and justice, that kind of world. So we live in an empire. To live in that kind of world, we have to change inside. We have to transform and become different people. Whole people. People who bring the light. People who bring compassion and mercy and justice. People who bring this kingdom into fruition. Because this kingdom is right in front of us at our fingertips. It's the, transcending self, transcending ego. It can be done. It's possible in every moment. As much as we'd like it to be, and as much as many of us could use it, this being a Christian and going to church thing is not therapy. We don't get to come here once a week and then go back out into the world being self-centered, oblivious people and somehow get to call ourselves the followers of Jesus. No, that's simply not enough. The reality is that Jesus told us over and over again to follow him. He never once said anything about worshiping him. Our teacher, Franciscan friar Richard Rohr, said, "We worship Jesus instead of following him on the same path. We made Jesus into a mere religion instead of a journey toward union with God and everything else. The shift made us into a religion of belonging and believing instead of a religion of transformation." He's right. Worshiping Jesus is cheap grace. But following Jesus? That's very scary. It's dangerous. Because the world doesn't want us looking up from our little screens and from our little universes and our busyness and our drama to reach out to others, especially paying attention to those who have no power and don't want it or can't access it. What Jesus taught was incendiary because it is so subversive. He turned everything upside down, and he wanted his followers to do the same. Jesus was here on business. He knew exactly what he was getting into. When he was growing up, the main roads would be lined with crucified political prisoners and criminals. He knew that by challenging the authorities, he was messing with the ruthless, brutal, and highly efficient Roman Empire. And that was a road to danger. And still, he told us, he commands us to follow him. Forget the values of wealth and empire. He said, follow me. Sell your belongings. Follow me. Turn your back on your tribe and follow me. Just leave the nets and the boats. Come on. We're going to go save the world. We're going to heal the sick. We're going to feed the hungry. We're going to clothe the naked. We're going to raise the dead. Never a word about, and you're going to worship me. We just celebrated the resurrection. So counterintuitive. Such a counterintuitive narrative. So unbelievable. But such a powerful truth. We're called to be Easter people, people of hope, not just in this season, not just on Sunday, in every moment, with every breath. In our reading it said, he opened their minds to understand the scriptures. He had to come back. You know, these disciples, bless their hearts, they were pretty thick. They still didn't get it. You know? He needed to prepare them for their mission, not just to the people of Israel, but to the entire world. He'd been working on this for some time, but they clearly were not ready. They needed something more, like us. Their eyes still needed to be opened. Their hearts still needed to be opened. They were in need of dramatic transformation, just like us. I find it very interesting that Luke has Jesus pointing out his feet and his hands and asking his disciples to look at them and to touch them. This teacher was all about his feet and his hands, right? His feet taking him far afield, away from the comforts of home and his neighborhood, the stability there. And the hands that broke bread and embraced and healed the sick and the broken and the diseased. The hands that wiped away the tears of the suffering. The hands that pointed out the flaws and hypocrisy of the Pharisees and their literal and small-minded interpretation of Torah. This is all a very clear and strong reminder that the disciples, and directly from that, anyone who claims to be a follower of Jesus, that we're called to be, as we say in our prayer, the very real and very tangible hands and feet of the Christ, of God in the world. Barbara Brown Taylor describes the way Jesus drew the disciples' attention to his hands and feet. She says that wounded and bruised, those same hands and feet were proof to the disciples that he had gone through the danger and not around it. Through the danger and not around it. So much of our time and energy is spent on finding the safe route around things rather than living through them. We deflect and we avoid pain and danger, the suffering of the people, the suffering of the earth. Another one of our teachers, Pema Chodron, the Buddhist teacher, she said, when fear arises, we do everything we can to get away from it. We take a pill, we say a prayer, we exercise, we meditate. And she says, instead, learn to lean in and embrace the sharp edges of fear. Because we have to figure out what to do about this. In our reading, we see that the disciples touched Jesus and heard his voice and fed his hunger and received his blessing. That's the same experience for people today, Christian and non-Christian, who feed the hungry, who break bread together, who hunger for the blessings of God, and respond to the call to turn our lives toward God. We are called to be Easter people, people of hope. We can have our doubts, that's okay. In fact, any clergy person worth her salt will tell you that doubt is a very clear signpost of healthy faith. Doubt is not the opposite of faith. Fear is the opposite of faith. And in case you haven't noticed, we live in a Good Friday world. It's a hard place to live in hope. But theologian Jürgen Moltmann said, genuine hope is not blind optimism. It is hope with open eyes, which sees the suffering and yet believes in the future. Paul, in one of his letters, famously said that love is patient. I'm telling you, there's no patience like the patience of hope that works towards a goal that is unlikely to be seen in one's lifetime. That is the essence of faith, and the truth of how we are called to be in the world. That work is still the right thing to do. It's still the next right thing. We are the only way that God shows up. Jim Wallace recently said, we have a political, religious, and moral crisis in America, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. If we're going to survive this crisis, or better yet, respond to it, or best yet, put our faith into action to turn dangers into opportunities, we are going to have to be more deeply rooted in our faith, in our relationship to each other, and in our solidarity with the most vulnerable. Easter has come and gone. Everything is supposed to be different now. But each day we're presented with constant opportunity to respond to others. In every encounter, we are always being called to bring the light. We are the ones who have raised our hands and said that we will bring hope. We will live with compassion. We will work for justice and mercy. May we leave here today and go back out into the world as Easter people, people of hope, changed people, and may we be people of change. This broken Good Friday world needs us. It's really time. May it be so. Amen.